Every man reaches a moment when power feels like ash in his hands. For King Eldric, that moment comes when he realizes his greatest victories mean nothing if his kingdom dies with him. The once mighty ruler sits alone in halls that echo with ghosts of fallen warriors, watching his realm fade like a dying ember. When Maera returns from exile, the healer who once mended his broken soldiers, she carries wounds that run deeper than war itself. Eldric makes a demand that shakes the very stones of his castle. She will bear his heir and restore the ancient magic that once protected their people. But this broken woman refuses to become just another vessel for a king's legacy. Can two damaged souls find healing in each other, or will their clash destroy the last hope for their dying kingdom? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crown sat heavy on Eldric's greying head, its once brilliant gold now tarnished to the colour of old bones. 30 years of war had forged him into a king, but 20 years of peace had revealed the hollowness beneath his victories. He stood at the great window of his throne room, watching the morning mist rise from fields that should have been green with spring growth. Instead, brown patches scarred the landscape like old wounds that refused to heal. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Magnus, his chief advisor. The man's silver beard and gentle eyes had been a constant presence since Eldric's coronation. "The merchants from the eastern provinces have arrived. They speak of failed harvests again." Eldric turned from the window, his weathered face baring lines that spoke of battles won and prices paid. At 53, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a soldier, but his blue eyes held a weariness that armor could never protect against. "The same story everywhere, Magnus. The land grows sick, and we grow old watching it die." The throne room stretched before him, vast and cold, despite the tapestries that hung from stone walls. Once, this hall had echoed with the laughter of courtiers and the music of celebration. Now it felt more like a tomb, too large for the dwindling court that remained. Most of the noble families had retreated to their distant holdings, leaving only the most loyal or most desperate to serve a king, whose kingdom crumbled beneath his feet. Magnus approached with measured steps, his walking stick tapping against the polished stone. "Perhaps it is time to consider the old texts again, my lord. The prophecies speak of restoration through bloodline." Eldric's voice carried the bitter edge of a man who had explored every avenue of hope. "I know the words by heart. Old friend, the royal line must continue. The ancient magic must be renewed." He gestured toward the empty throne beside his own, crafted for a queen who had died before she could warm its seat. "But what good are prophecies to a king without an heir?" The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone drew their attention to the courtyard below. Eldric watched as a simple weathered cart pulled up to the castle gates, drawn by a single horse that looked as tired as its driver. But it was the figure who slowly climbed down from the cart's bed that made the king's breath catch in his throat. Even from this distance, even wrapped in a worn brown cloak, he knew her. Maera, the woman who had saved more lives than his sword had taken. The healer whose gentle hands had pulled his men back from death's threshold in field hospitals that reeked of blood and desperation. The woman he had banished 5 years ago in a moment of rage that had haunted him ever since. "My God," Magnus whispered beside him, following the king's gaze. "Is that—" "Yes." Eldric's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's her." Maera moved slowly across the courtyard, and even at this distance Eldric could see the change in her. Where once she had glided with purpose and grace, now she walked with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to trust the ground beneath her feet. Her auburn hair, once braided with flowers and herbs, hung loose and unkempt beneath her hood. She carried a worn leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than a woman her size should bear. "Why has she returned?" Magnus asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that Eldric didn't miss. The king watched as Clara, his head servant, rushed out to greet the unexpected visitor. Clara's round face broke into a smile of genuine joy, the first Eldric had seen in his castle for months. The older woman embraced Maera with the warmth of someone welcoming home a beloved daughter, and for a moment, some of the tension seemed to leave the healer's shoulders. "I don't know," Eldric replied, but his mind was already racing. The timing of her return, just as he had been contemplating the old prophecies, felt like more than mere coincidence. But perhaps the fates have decided to offer us one last chance. Clara led Maera toward the castle's main entrance, her voice carrying up to the throne room window. "Oh, my dear child, look at you, so thin, so worn. Come, let's get you fed and warmed. The king will want to see you, but first you need proper care." Eldric watched Maera shake her head at something Clara said, saw her gesture toward the gates, as if planning to leave. But Clara's insistence won out, as it usually did, and soon the two women disappeared into the castle's lower levels. "She doesn't look well," Magnus observed quietly. That was an understatement. Even from afar, Eldric could see that the vibrant woman he remembered had been replaced by someone who looked as though life had drained the very essence from her being. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been pleasantly curved, and she moved with the hesitant steps of someone who expected pain at every turn. 5 years of exile will do that to a person, Eldric said, the words heavy with regret. He rarely allowed himself to feel. 5 years of believing your king thinks you're a failure. "You did what you thought was right at the time," Magnus said gently. "The queen's death was not her fault, but grief makes men act rashly." Eldric's hand moved unconsciously to the ring on his finger, his wedding band, still worn despite his wife's death 6 years ago. Elena had been carrying their first child when the fever took her, the same fever that had claimed dozens of lives. Throughout the kingdom, despite Maera's desperate efforts to find a cure, in his anguish, Eldric had needed someone to blame, and Maera's inability to save his wife and unborn child had made her an easy target. "Rashly," he repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. "I destroyed the life of the woman who had saved countless others. I called her a fraud and a failure in front of the entire court, and then I banished her from the only home she had ever known. Yet she has returned," Magnus pointed out. "Perhaps she has forgiven you." Eldric doubted that. Forgiveness required a generosity of spirit that he wasn't sure he deserved, but her return did present an opportunity, one that his kingdom desperately needed. The prophecies were clear about what was required for the land's restoration, and Maera was the only woman of noble blood who possessed the ancient gift of healing. She was also, according to the old texts, the only one who could bear an heir, capable of renewing the magical bonds that protected their realm. "Arrange for her to be brought to the private dining hall," Eldric commanded, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Tonight, after she has rested, we have much to discuss." Magnus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "My lord, perhaps it would be wise to approach this delicately. The lady has suffered much. The kingdom has suffered more." Eldric cut him off. "Every day we wait, more crops fail, more people flee to neighboring realms, more of our strength bleeds away. We cannot afford delicacy when survival is at stake." As Magnus bowed and withdrew to make arrangements, Eldric remained at the window, his gaze fixed on the courtyard where Maera had stood. He tried to reconcile the broken woman he had just seen with his memories of the healer who had once moved through his army's camps like an angel of mercy. She'd been young then, perhaps 25, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and hands that could coax life back into the most grievously wounded soldiers. He remembered watching her work, fascinated by the way she combined practical medicine with something deeper, an intuitive understanding of how to heal not just bodies, but spirits. She had never been conventionally beautiful, but there had been something luminous about her that drew people like moths to flame. Soldiers had fought harder, knowing she was there to tend their wounds. Officers had consulted her not just about medical matters, but about strategy and morale, and Elena had loved her like a sister. That memory hit him harder than expected. His wife had delighted in Maera's company, the two women often spending hours in Elena's garden, discussing herbs and remedies and the mysteries of healing magic. Elena had been the one to insist that Maera be given quarters in the castle, the one who had defended the healer against courtiers who whispered about her humble origins. "She has the gift," Elena had told him once, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "When our child is born, I want her to be the one to deliver him. I trust her completely." But Maera hadn't been able to save Elena or their son. And in his grief-fueled rage, Eldric had destroyed the one person his wife had trusted most. Now, as he stood in his empty throne room, he wondered if he was about to compound that sin with an even greater one. The prophecy was clear about what was needed: a royal heir born of both bloodlines, the warrior line and the healer line, bound together in willing union. But how could he ask such a thing of a woman he had wronged so deeply? How could he demand that she bear his children when he had failed to protect the family she had tried so desperately to save? The answer came to him with the cold clarity of a winter morning. He would ask because he was a king, and kings did what was necessary for their kingdoms, regardless of the personal cost. He would ask because the alternative was watching his realm die slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remained but legends and ruins. He would ask, and if necessary, he would command, because sometimes mercy was a luxury that kings could not afford. The private dining hall had been Elena's favorite room in the castle. Smaller than the Great Hall, it featured tall windows that overlooked the rose garden she had tended with such care. Eldric had chosen it deliberately, hoping the memories it held might soften the conversation he was about to have. Now, as he waited for Maera's arrival, he wondered if surrounding himself with ghosts had been a mistake. Clara had reported that Maera had slept most of the afternoon, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who hadn't felt safe enough to rest properly in years. She had eaten little, picking at the bread and soup Clara brought her, and had spoken even less. When asked about her years in exile, she had simply said, "I survived," in a voice that suggested survival had come at a considerable cost. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced her arrival. Eldric straightened in his chair, trying to arrange his features into an expression that conveyed authority without cruelty. He needed her cooperation, not her fear, though he suspected he might end up with both. Clara opened the door and stepped aside to let Maera enter. "My lady," she said gently, "His Majesty is waiting for you." Maera paused in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The lamplight revealed what daylight had hidden, the true extent of the damage 5 years of exile had wrought. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that looked paper-thin. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her hair, though clean now, was streaked with premature grey. But it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully. Once bright with compassion and purpose, they now held the flat wariness of someone who had learned to expect pain from every interaction. "Maera," he said softly, rising from his chair, "thank you for coming." She stepped into the room with the careful movements of someone navigating a minefield. Her simple brown dress, clearly one of Clara's cast-offs, hung loose on her diminished frame. She kept her hands clasped tightly before her, and Eldric noticed the faint tremor in her fingers. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a brief curtsy that spoke more of habit than respect. Her voice was hoarse, as if she had forgotten how to use it properly. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from him. "You must be tired from your journey." Maera remained standing, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past his left shoulder. "I won't be staying long. I only came to—" She faltered, seeming to lose the thread of her words. "To what?" Eldric prompted gently. "To return this." She reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew something that made Eldric's breath catch. It was a small silver pendant, Elena's pendant, the one she had given to Maera as a token of their friendship. It belongs here, not with me. Eldric stared at the pendant, remembering the day Elena had pressed it into Maera's hands. Keep it, she had said, so you'll always remember that you have a sister in this castle. The sight of it now, offered back like a rejected gift, struck him more deeply than he had expected. Elena gave that to you, he said quietly. She would want you to keep it. Elena is dead. The words came out flat and final, and according to you, it's my fault she died. So I shouldn't carry her memory. The accusation hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Eldric felt the familiar weight of his guilt settle on his shoulders, heavier now than it had been even in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death. I was wrong, he said, the admission coming harder than any battlefield command he had ever given. What I said, what I did, it was grief speaking, not reason. You tried everything to save her. I know that now. Maera's composure cracked slightly, a flash of old pain crossing her features before she reassembled her mask of indifference. Your apology comes 5 years too late. I know. He gestured again to the chair. Please, sit. There are things we need to discuss. This time, she complied, perching on the edge of the seat, as if ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Eldric settled back into his own chair, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. How did one ask such a thing? How did a king demand that a woman bear his children for the good of the realm? The kingdom is dying, he began, deciding that directness might serve him better than diplomacy. The crops fail, the people flee, and nothing I do seems to halt the decay. I've consulted with every advisor, every scholar, every wise woman within our borders. They all point to the same conclusion. Maera said nothing, but her fingers tightened around Elena's pendant. The old magic that protected this land is fading, Eldric continued. The bonds that connected the royal bloodline to the realm's prosperity are breaking, and according to the ancient prophecies, there is only one way to renew them. Through a royal heir, Maera said quietly, her voice betraying no emotion. Born of both the warrior line and the healer line, conceived in willing union. Eldric felt a flicker of surprise. You know the prophecy. I know many things, Your Majesty, including the fact that you have no queen and no prospects for one. She raised her eyes to meet his for the first time since entering the room. Which is why you summoned me here. The conversation was moving faster than he had anticipated, but perhaps that was for the best. Maera had always been sharp, quick to grasp implications that others missed. You are the last of the healer bloodline, he said, the only woman who carries both the gift and the lineage necessary to fulfill the prophecy. Am I? Her laugh held no humor. Look at me, Your Majesty. Do I look like someone with the gift? Do these hands, she held up her trembling fingers, look capable of healing anything? The gift can return, Eldric said, though he wasn't entirely certain of that himself. With time, with proper care, with a royal womb to fill? The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut stone. How convenient for you that the salvation of your kingdom requires me to spread my legs for the man who destroyed my life. Eldric flinched at her crudeness, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. It's not like that, isn't it? Maera stood abruptly, the pendant still clutched in her fist. Let me see if I understand this correctly. Your kingdom is failing, and the only solution is for me to bear your heir. Not because you love me, not because you want me as your queen, but because some dusty prophecy says it's the only way to restore your magical borders. The prophecy is convenient, she interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. It gives you a divine mandate to take what you want without having to acknowledge it as rape. The word hit him like a physical blow. I would never force. You already are. She took a step toward the door, then stopped and turned back to face him. Do you think I have a choice here, truly? A destitute exile with nowhere to go and no one to protect her? What happens if I refuse your generous offer? Eldric opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, because she was right. And they both knew it. A woman in her position had very little power to refuse a king's demands, no matter how politely they were phrased. "I see," she said, reading his silence correctly. "So I can submit willingly and be called a patriot, or I can refuse and be forced anyway. Either way, you get your heir and your kingdom gets its salvation." "It doesn't have to be that way," Eldric said desperately. "You would be queen, you would have power, position, protection. I would be a broodmare with a crown." Maera moved toward the door again. "Thank you for the generous offer, Your Majesty, but I decline." Maera, wait. He rose from his chair, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used with subordinates. "You cannot simply walk away from this. The kingdom needs—" "The kingdom," she said, turning back one final time, "can burn for all I care. You made sure I have no stake in its survival when you stripped me of everything that mattered to me." She tossed Eleanor's pendant onto the table. "Between them, find another way to save your realm. I won't be your solution." She reached for the door handle, but Eldric's next words stopped her cold. "You'll carry my sons, whether you want it or not." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Maera's hand froze on the door handle, her knuckles white with tension. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "What did you say?" Eldric knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The words had come from the darkest part of his nature, the part that had made him a successful war king but a terrible man. But now that they were spoken, he couldn't take them back. "The kingdom comes before everything," he said, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "Before your comfort, before your wishes, before your freedom. You will bear my heir because the realm requires it. The prophecy will be fulfilled." Maera turned slowly, her face pale as death. "And if I refuse, then you will be confined to the castle until you change your mind, or until you carry my child regardless of your feelings on the matter." She stared at him for a long moment, and Eldric saw something die in her eyes, some last flickering ember of hope or trust that his words had finally extinguished. "There is the king I remember," she said softly. "The one who values duty above humanity, the one who would sacrifice anyone and anything for the greater good." She straightened her shoulders, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of the proud woman she had once been. "Very well, Your Majesty. You have made your position clear. But understand this. You may command my body, but you will never have my willing cooperation. Whatever children come from this arrangement will know exactly what their father is." With that, she pulled open the door and walked out, leaving Eldric alone with the taste of ash in his mouth and the certain knowledge that he had just made the greatest mistake of his life. The winter storm arrived 3 days after their confrontation. As if summoned by the frost that had settled between them, Maera stood at the window of the tower room where Eldric had ordered her to be housed. Not quite a prison, but certainly not a guest chamber. The glass was thick with ice, distorting her view of the courtyard below where snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets. She had tried to leave twice. The first time, Clara had intercepted her at the kitchen door, with tears in her eyes and gentle hands that guided her back inside. "Please, my lady," the older woman had whispered. "The roads are dangerous, and you have nowhere to go. Stay until spring, at least." The second attempt had been stopped by Magnus himself, appearing at the main gate with a sorrowful expression and an escort of guards who made it clear that her departure was not optional. "His Majesty's orders," he had said, not meeting her eyes, "for your own protection." Protection. The word sat bitter on her tongue as she traced patterns in the frost with her fingertip. She was a prisoner, albeit one housed in a comfortable cell with warm meals and clean linens. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had more comfort now than she'd known in years of exile, yet she felt more trapped than ever. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Come in," she called, not bothering to turn from the window. "My lady," Clara's voice was tentative, "I've brought your supper." Maera finally turned, studying the round-faced woman who had been the closest thing to a mother she'd ever known. Clara had aged in the 5 years since Maera's exile, her brown hair now completely silver and her face lined with new wrinkles. But her eyes still held the same warmth that had comforted a young healer learning her craft in this very castle. "You don't have to call me my lady," Maera said softly. "I'm not nobility. I never was." Clara set the tray on the small table by the fireplace, then turned with her hands on her hips, a gesture Maera remembered well from her youth. "Nobility isn't about bloodlines, child. It's about how you treat others, how you carry yourself in the world. And you, my dear, have always had more nobility in your little finger than most of those who were born to it." Maera almost smiled at that. "Almost. Even when I'm being held prisoner in my own home?" "This is still your home," Clara said firmly. "It always has been, no matter what foolish words were spoken in anger." She busied herself arranging the food on the table. Warm bread, hearty stew, fresh fruit that must have cost a fortune in winter. "The king regrets what he said, you know. I can see it in his eyes." "Regret doesn't undo words," Maera replied, though she moved to sit at the table. She had learned not to waste food during her years of exile, even when her appetite had fled. "Entirely." Clara settled into the chair across from her, her expression growing serious. "Tell me about these years away. Where did you go? How did you survive?" Maera broke off a piece of bread, considering how much truth she could bear to share. "North," she said finally, "to the borderlands where the old magic still runs wild. I thought perhaps I could find answers there, maybe even find a way to restore what I'd lost." "Your gift," Clara said gently. "My gift, my purpose, my sense of who I was." Maera took a sip of the wine Clara had brought, real wine, not the watered-down ale she'd grown accustomed to. "I spent 2 years with a hermit who claimed to understand the old ways. He was half mad, but he knew things about healing magic that no one else did." She didn't mention how the hermit had tried to touch her in ways that had nothing to do with healing, or how she'd had to flee his mountain cave in the middle of a blizzard. She didn't speak of the months she'd spent in a border town, working as a seamstress because no one would trust a healer who couldn't heal. She certainly didn't mention the nobleman's son who had cornered her in an alley and left her with bruises that took weeks to fade. "Did you learn anything useful?" Clara asked. Maera held up her hands, studying the fingers that had once been steady. "And sure, I learned that some things once broken cannot be mended. The gift requires not just knowledge, but faith in yourself, in your purpose, in the rightness of what you're doing. When that faith dies, the magic dies with it." "Faith can be rebuilt," Clara said gently. "Can it?" Maera met her eyes. "When the man who destroyed it demands that you bear his children for the good of his kingdom? When you're told that your body is more valuable than your consent?" Clara's face crumpled slightly. "Oh, child, what he's asking of you, it's wrong. I know it's wrong, but he's desperate, and desperate men make terrible choices. Desperate or not, I won't be his broodmare." Maera set down her spoon, her appetite finally deserting her entirely. "I've spent 5 years learning to value myself, learning that I'm worth more than what I can do for others. I won't give that up, not even to save this kingdom." Clara reached across the table and took her hand. "What if there was another way? What if you could help save the realm without sacrificing yourself?" "There isn't." Maera pulled her hand away, not unkindly but firmly. "The prophecy is clear. Royal blood, healer blood, willing union. Even if I wanted to help, which I don't, the willing part is rather important, don't you think?" "Perhaps willingness can grow," Clara suggested hopefully. "Perhaps if you spent time with him, got to know the man he's become, the man he's become." Maera's laugh was sharp. "He's exactly the same as he always was, Clara. A king who sees people as resources to be managed, problems to be solved. The only difference is that now I'm the resource he needs." Outside, the wind howled around the tower, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling in mad patterns. Maera found herself thinking of the rose garden that lay buried beneath all that white. Elena's garden, where they had spent so many peaceful afternoons discussing herbs and remedies and the mysteries of healing. She had loved Elena like a sister. had been genuinely excited about the coming child. When the fever struck, Maera had worked for 3 days without sleep, trying every remedy she knew, calling on every scrap of power she possessed. She had felt Eleanor slipping away despite her efforts, had sensed the child's life force flickering like a candle in a hurricane, and when they both died, Eldric had looked at her with such hatred, such absolute condemnation, that something in her had simply shattered. The words he'd spoken in his grief, useless, failure, fraud, had cut deeper than any blade, because part of her had believed them to be true. He loved her, Clara said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. He loved Elena so much that losing her nearly destroyed him. Men like that, when they're in pain, they lash out at whatever's nearest. I was nearest, Maera agreed, and convenient. Easier to blame the healer than to accept that sometimes people die despite our best efforts. He knows that now, does he? Because from where I sit, it seems like he's making the same mistake again, trying to control forces beyond his power, trying to bend the world to his will through sheer determination. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Finally she spoke again. "The garden is dying." Maera looked up sharply. "What?" "Eleanor's garden. The roses, the herbs, everything. It started failing not long after you left, and now—" Clara shrugged helplessly. "Now it's nothing but dead earth. We've tried everything. New soil, different plantings, prayers from the court chaplain. Nothing grows there anymore." Something cold settled in Maera's stomach. "That's impossible. The garden was planted on a natural convergence of energy lines. It should be fertile, regardless of what we plant there." "Come see for yourself," Clara challenged gently. "Tomorrow, when the storm passes, see what your exile has cost this place." Maera wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that the garden's fate was not her responsibility, but curiosity was a hard habit to break, and despite everything she found herself nodding. "Fine, but don't expect me to try to fix it. I told you, my gift is gone." "Perhaps," Clara said, rising from her chair, "or perhaps it's simply sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake." After Clara left, Maera returned to her vigil at the window. The storm was intensifying, the wind driving snow horizontal across the courtyard. She thought about the garden, lying dead beneath all that white, and despite her best efforts, she felt a pang of genuine sorrow. Elena had been so proud of that garden, so certain that it would outlive them all. "The healing herbs will grow here long after we're gone," she had said once, her hands gentle on her swollen belly. "Our children will play among the roses, and their children after them." Now the garden was barren, Elena was dead, and there would be no children playing among the roses, just a broken healer and a desperate king, trapped together in a castle that had become a tomb of dead dreams. Maera pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and wondered if some prisons were built not to keep people in, but to keep the world out. The storm broke near dawn, leaving the world outside transformed into a crystalline wonderland. Maera had barely slept, her dreams filled with fragments of memory and prophecy that left her feeling more exhausted than rest. When Clara knocked at her door, she was already dressed and ready, though she couldn't have said what she was ready for. "The garden?" Clara asked simply. "The garden," Maera confirmed. They made their way through corridors that seemed smaller than she remembered, past tapestries that hung faded and moth-eaten in the morning light. The castle felt hollow, as if half its inhabitants had simply vanished, leaving behind only echoes and empty spaces. "How many people remain?" Maera asked, as they descended a narrow staircase she remembered climbing countless times as a young woman. "Perhaps a third of what there once was," Clara replied sadly. "The nobles fled to their country estates when the harvests began failing. The merchants followed the trade routes to more prosperous kingdoms. Now it's mostly just the servants who have nowhere else to go, and the guards who are too loyal to abandon their posts." They passed through the kitchen, where Maera saw only 3 cooks, where once there had been 12. The women looked up as they passed, offering shy smiles that suggested Clara had been talking about her return. Maera nodded politely but didn't stop to chat. She wasn't ready for the well-meaning curiosity of people who remembered her from before. The door to the garden stood slightly ajar, winter air creeping through the gap like a cold invitation. Clara pushed it open, and Maera stepped outside into a scene that stopped her breath. The garden was indeed dead, not dormant, not resting for winter, but truly lifeless. The soil was grey and cracked despite the recent snow, as if something had drained all the nutrients from the earth itself. The wooden trellises that had once supported climbing roses stood bare and brittle, their joints separating in the cold. Even the stone paths were cracking, weeds growing up through gaps that shouldn't exist. "My God," Maera whispered, kneeling to touch the barren soil. It felt wrong beneath her fingers, not just depleted, but poisoned somehow, as if something toxic had leached into the very foundation of the garden. "It happened gradually at first," Clara said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The roses bloomed smaller, the herbs lost their potency, but in the last 2 years, it's been like this. Completely barren. Nothing will grow here now." Maera stood slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't natural crop failure or seasonal dormancy. This was magical exhaustion, the kind that happened when the energy lines that fed a place were severed or redirected. But that should have been impossible. The convergence beneath this garden was one of the strongest she'd ever encountered. "Has anything else changed?" she asked. "Any new construction nearby? Any alterations to the castle's foundations?" "Nothing major. Magnus had some work done in the lower levels, reinforcing the dungeons and storage areas. But that was years ago, well before the garden started failing." Maera's unease deepened. Structural work near a magical convergence could indeed disrupt the energy flow, but the timing didn't quite fit. "Unless, where exactly did Magnus do this work?" she asked. Clara pointed toward the eastern wing of the castle. "Below the old armory mostly. He said it was for security, in case we ever came under siege." Maera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. The eastern wing was directly beneath one of the major energy lines that fed the garden. If Magnus had been digging there, if he had unknowingly or knowingly disrupted the magical flow, it would explain the garden's death. But it would also raise uncomfortable questions about why such work had been undertaken in the first place. "Clara," she said carefully, "who ordered the work in the dungeons?" "Magnus himself, I believe. He brought it to the king as a security measure, and his majesty approved it." Clara's brow furrowed. "Why? What does that have to do with the garden?" Before Maera could answer, footsteps crunched across the snow behind them. She turned to see Eldric approaching, wrapped in a heavy cloak that made his broad shoulders appear even more imposing. His face was carefully neutral, but she caught the flicker of something, guilt, regret, in his eyes as he took in the devastation around them. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly. "Surveying the damage?" Maera's voice was cooler than the winter air. "Seeing what 5 years of my absence has cost your precious castle. Seeing what my mistakes have cost all of us," he replied, surprising her with his honesty. "Clara tells me you've been asking about the construction work." So he had been listening, or Clara had been reporting back to him. Maera filed that information away for later consideration. "The garden is dying because something has disrupted the energy convergence beneath it. If Magnus has been digging in the eastern wing, he has." Eldric moved closer, his breath visible in small puffs as he spoke. "Extensive work, over the course of several years. I approved it without really understanding what it might affect." "You should have consulted someone who understood the magical infrastructure of this place," Maera said, crouching down again to examine the soil more closely. "The energy lines that run beneath this castle are older than the building itself. Disrupt them carelessly and," she gestured at the barren earth around them, "and you end up with dead gardens and failing crops." Eldric finished. "We know that now. The question is, can it be fixed?" Maera stood, brushing dirt from her hands. I wouldn't know. I'm not a healer anymore, remember. Just a failed exile who couldn't save your wife. The words hung between them like drawn blades. Eldric's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice remained steady. You saved hundreds of lives during the war. Elena's death doesn't erase that, doesn't it? Maera's laugh was bitter. According to you, it made me a fraud and a failure. Those were your words, Your Majesty, spoken in front of the entire court. I was wrong. The admission came quietly, almost lost in the wind that stirred the dead leaves at their feet. I was grieving and angry, and I needed someone to blame. You were the closest target. How convenient for you that your target is now the solution to your problems. Eldric stepped closer, close enough that she could see the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. It doesn't have to be like this between us, Maera. We were friends once, before you banished me for failing to work miracles. She met his gaze steadily. We were never friends, Eldric. I was your wife's friend, your kingdom's healer. You tolerated me because I was useful. That's not true, isn't it? Then why, in all the years I lived in this castle, did you never once speak to me about anything other than my duties? Why did you never ask about my thoughts, my hopes, my dreams? I was a tool to you then, and I'm a tool to you now. The only difference is the use you want to put me to. Clara cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued indoors. The cold isn't good for any of us. But Maera wasn't ready to retreat to the castle's warmth just yet. Something about the garden's condition nagged at her, something beyond the simple disruption of energy lines. She walked toward the center of the space where Elena's prized roses had once bloomed in abundance. This is wrong, she murmured, kneeling beside what had once been the garden's heart. The damage is too complete, too uniform. A disrupted energy line would cause patchy death, areas of weakness mixed with areas of relative health. This, she gestured at the uniform devastation around them. This looks deliberate. What do you mean? Eldric moved to stand beside her, his earlier defensiveness forgotten in the face of her professional assessment. I mean, someone has been draining the life from this place systematically. The construction work might have provided access, but this level of magical exhaustion requires active intervention. She looked up at him, her expression grim. Someone has been siphoning the energy from your castle's foundations for years. The implications of her words settled over them like a shroud. If Maera was right, then the kingdom's decline wasn't a matter of natural decay or divine disfavor. It was sabotage, carried out by someone with both access to the castle and knowledge of its magical infrastructure. Magnus, Eldric breathed, his face going pale beneath his beard. You don't know that, Clara said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. He's served this kingdom faithfully for decades. Why would he? Power, Maera said simply, or revenge. Or perhaps he's been bought by someone who wants to see this kingdom fall. She stood, brushing snow from her knees. The why matters less than the how. If I'm right, and if the sabotage continues, this place will be completely dead within a year. Eldric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ruins of his wife's beloved garden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. Can you stop it? I don't know, Maera admitted. Even if my gift were intact, this kind of work requires time and resources I don't have. And without cooperation from whoever has been doing this, you'll have whatever you need, Eldric said firmly. Whatever resources, whatever assistance, whatever authority. If there's even a chance you can save this place, at what cost? Maera's question cut through his growing enthusiasm. What do you expect in return for your generosity, Your Majesty? Because I suspect your offer comes with strings attached. His silence was answer enough. Maera nodded grimly, having expected nothing less. So we're back to your original proposition, she said. Help save your kingdom, bear your heir, and in return, I get the privilege of watching everything I care. about wither and die while I play the role of dutiful queen. It doesn't have to be that way, Eldric said desperately. If we work together, if we can restore the magic, then what? We pretend this conversation never happened. We pretend you didn't threaten to force me if I refused. Maera shook her head. Some words once spoken cannot be taken back. She turned and walked toward the castle, leaving both Eldric and Clara standing amid the devastation of Elena's garden. But as she reached the door, she paused and looked back at the king, who stood like a statue among the dead roses. "I'll think about what you've said," she called to him. "But understand this. If I choose to help, it will be my choice, not your command. And it will be on my terms, not yours." With that, she disappeared into the castle, leaving Eldric alone with the ruins of his wife's dreams and the growing certainty that saving his kingdom might cost him what remained of his soul. Eldric found his war journal that evening, buried beneath official correspondence and forgotten reports in his private study. The leather binding was worn smooth by years of handling, its pages yellowed and crackling at the edges. He hadn't opened it since Elena's death, couldn't bear to read his own words about strategy and victory when his greatest battle had been lost in a sick room. But Maera's accusations that afternoon had stirred something in him, a need to remember who he had been before grief and desperation had twisted him into someone he barely recognized. He lit a candle against the gathering darkness and opened the journal to a random page. Day 847 of the Northern Campaign. Young Corwin took a crossbow bolt to the shoulder today. By rights, he should have lost the arm, if not his life. But the healer worked on him for 3 hours straight, her hands glowing with that strange light she conjures when the healing runs deep. "He'll be back on his feet within a week," she says, and I believe her. I've never seen anything like what she can do. The men call her the Angel of Mercy, though she laughs when she hears it. "I'm no angel," she told me yesterday. "Angels don't curse like sailors when they're frustrated." But watching her work, seeing the way pain seems to simply drain away at her touch, if that's not divine intervention, it's something close to it. Eldric's throat tightened as he read his own words. He remembered that day clearly. Corwin had been one of his youngest soldiers, barely 18 and eager to prove himself. The boy had been weeping not from pain, but from fear that he'd be sent home in disgrace. Maera had not only saved his arm, but his pride, crafting a story about how bravely he had endured the healing process. He turned the page, finding another entry from later in the campaign. She refuses to take a bigger tent. Insists she doesn't. Need more comfort than the common soldiers. Elena would like her, I think. They're both stubborn women who care more about others than themselves. I've ordered a proper pavilion anyway. She needs space to work, to store her supplies properly. She can curse me for the presumption if she likes. Magnus suggested today that we recruit more healers, build a proper medical corps. Sound strategy, but I doubt we'll find anyone with half her skill. She has an intuition for healing that can't be taught, only admired. Eldric set the journal aside, his candle flickering in a draught that crept through the stone walls. How had that admiration curdled into blame? How had the woman he had once trusted, with his soldiers' lives, become someone he could threaten and coerce? The answer lay in Elena's death, of course, but reading his own words from the battlefield, he began to see a different truth, that his faith in Maera's abilities had been so complete that when she failed to save his wife, it had felt like a betrayal rather than a tragedy. He had expected miracles from her because she had provided them so many times before. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in!" he called, expecting Magnus or one of the servants. Instead, Maera entered, carrying a tray of tea and looking uncomfortable with her own presence there. She had changed from her winter clothes into one of the simple dresses Clara had provided, and her hair was braided back in a style that reminded him painfully of how she had worn it during the war years. "I brought tea," she said awkwardly, setting the tray on his desk. "Clara thought you might appreciate it." Clara sent you. Eldric couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. She suggested I bring it myself. Maera's hands fidgeted with her skirts. I think she's trying to encourage reconciliation through acts of domestic service. Despite everything, Eldric almost smiled at that. Clara had been managing the emotional lives of castle residents for as long as he could remember, deploying food and small kindnesses like strategic weapons against discord. "Will you sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We should talk." Maera remained standing, but she didn't leave either. "About what happened in the garden. About what's been happening between us since you returned." Eldric poured tea for both of them, the familiar ritual providing a moment's respite from the tension. "I've been reading old journal entries from the war, remembering how things used to be." "They can't be that way again," Maera said quietly. "Too much has changed." "I know." He offered her a cup, pleased when she accepted it. "But perhaps we can find something better than this constant anger between us." Maera took a sip of the tea, her expression thoughtful. "You really believe Magnus is behind the sabotage?" "I don't want to believe it," Eldric admitted. "But the evidence is pointing in that direction. The timing of the construction, the systematic nature of the energy drain. It would take someone with intimate knowledge of the castle to accomplish what's been done. And someone with your complete trust," Maera added. "Someone who could order major construction projects without raising suspicion." Eldric nodded grimly. Magnus had been his advisor since before his coronation, had served his father before him. The idea that such loyalty might be false was almost too painful to contemplate. "What would you need to be certain?" he asked. "Access to the areas where the construction took place. Time to examine the magical infrastructure properly, and—" She hesitated. "What?" "I would need to try to use my gift again. To sense the energy flows, to understand what's been disrupted." Her hands tightened around her teacup. "But I told you, it's gone. I haven't been able to heal so much as a scraped knee in 5 years. What if it's not gone?" Eldric leaned forward, his voice gentle. "What if it's just blocked somehow, like a stream that's been dammed rather than dried up?" Maera's laugh held no humor. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Your Majesty. I've learned not to indulge in it." "Call me Eldric," he said, impulsively. "At least when we're alone like this, the formality feels wrong." She studied his face for a long moment. "Does it? Because you've been quite insistent on the king and subject dynamic when it serves your purposes." The rebuke stung because it was accurate. "You're right. I have been using my authority as a weapon against you. He searched for the right words. "Right. It's easier than admitting I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of losing everything, of watching this kingdom crumble while I stand helpless to stop it, of being remembered as the king who let it all fall apart." He met her eyes. "Of dying alone in an empty castle with no one to mourn me." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they wanted to cross. Maera set down her teacup and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered courtyard. "Loneliness isn't solved by forcing someone to bear your children," she said finally. "I know that now." Eldric rose from his chair, moving to stand beside her at the window. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about choice. Right, what I proposed, what I demanded, it wasn't partnership. It was subjugation. And yet here we are," Maera said softly, "still discussing the prophecy, still dancing around the fact that you need an heir, and I'm the only woman who can provide one." "The prophecy requires willing union," Eldric reminded her. "Without that, any child born would be illegitimate in the eyes of the magic, yes." Maera turned to face him. "But willingness can't be commanded, Eldric. It has to be earned. What would it take?" The question came out more vulnerable than he had intended. "To earn it, I mean. What would it take for you to choose this path?" "Freely." Maera was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Time," she said, "time to remember who I used to be, to see if my gift can truly return. Time to decide if I can trust you not to become the tyrant again when things don't go as you expect. And if you decide you can trust me, then we'll see." She moved away from the window, back toward the door. "But understand, this isn't a negotiation, Eldric. I'm not bargaining with you. I'm simply telling you what would need to happen for me to consider this willingly." "I understand." She paused with her hand on the door handle. "Do you? Because the moment you try to force this, the moment you use your authority to pressure me into compliance, any possibility of willing cooperation dies forever." "I won't," he promised, and meant it. "Whatever happens between us, it will be your choice." Maera nodded slowly. "We'll see if you can keep that promise when winter ends and your kingdom grows more desperate." With that, she slipped out of his study, leaving Eldric alone with his cooling tea and the growing understanding that saving his kingdom might require becoming a better man than he had ever been before. The healing spring lay hidden in a grove of ancient oaks behind the castle's eastern wall, its location known only to a few. Maera had discovered it during her first year as the castle's healer, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name to the small depression where clear water bubbled up from underground sources. For years, she had brought her most difficult cases here, patients who needed more than conventional medicine could provide. Now, 3 weeks after their conversation in Eldric's study, she found herself walking the snow-covered path that led to the spring. The winter had been harsh, and she expected to find the water frozen solid. Instead, she discovered something that made her heart skip a beat. The spring still flowed. Not just flowed, it sparkled with a faint luminescence that spoke of magic. Still alive in the earth, the water moved in gentle eddies around stones that should have been locked in ice, and the air above the pool shimmered with warmth that had nothing to do with the weak winter sun. "Impossible," she whispered, kneeling. Beside the spring's edge, the magical convergence that fed this place should have been affected by the same drainage that had killed Elena's garden. Yet here was clear evidence that some of the old power remained untouched. She cupped her hands and dipped them into the water, gasping as she felt the familiar tingle of magical energy against her skin. For a moment, just a moment, she thought. She felt an answering resonance from somewhere deep inside herself, like an echo of the gift she had lost. "I thought I might find you here." Maera looked up to see Eldric approaching through the trees, his cloak dusted with snow and his expression carefully neutral. She stood quickly, water dripping from her hands. "How did you know about this place?" "I followed you," he admitted. "You've been walking this way every morning for the past week. I was curious." He stopped at the edge of the grove, not approaching. "The spring itself. What is this place?" "A source," Maera said simply. "One of the few natural springs in the kingdom where the old magic still runs strong. I used to bring patients here when they needed more than ordinary healing." Eldric's eyes widened as he took in the flowing water and the subtle light that danced above its surface. "It's still active. Even with everything else dying, this place is still alive." "It shouldn't be." Maera turned back to study the spring more closely. If Magnus has been systematically draining the magical infrastructure, this should be as dead as everything else, unless it's protected somehow, Eldric suggested, moving closer despite his obvious reluctance to intrude on what felt like sacred ground. "Or hidden." Maera's mind was racing now, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. This spring is fed by the deepest energy lines in the region, ones that predate the castle by centuries. If someone wanted to drain the kingdom's magic, while preserving a reserve for themselves, they would isolate the most powerful source, Eldric finished, understanding immediately. "Keep it secret, keep it safe, while everything else withered, which means our saboteur knows about this place." Maera's voice was grim, "and they've been careful to leave it untouched for their own purposes. The implications of that hung heavy. Between them, if the spring had been deliberately preserved while everything else died, it suggested a level of planning and foresight that spoke to something far more sinister than simple sabotage. "Magnus knows about this place," Eldric said quietly. "I showed it to him years ago," Maera confirmed. "Along with Elena, we thought it might be useful for the kingdom's medical needs." She laughed bitterly. How naive we were. Eldric stepped closer to the spring's edge, studying the play of light across the water. Could this place heal what's been done to the castle? Theoretically, yes. If I could channel its power, direct it back into the disrupted energy lines— Maera stopped, shaking her head. "But that would require the kind of working I haven't attempted in years. And even if I could still do it, the amount of power needed would be enormous, dangerous, potentially fatal," she admitted. "Channeling that much raw magical energy through a human body, even one trained for healing, is like trying to direct a river through a garden hose. One mistake, one moment of lost control, and you could die," Eldric said flatly. "I could die," she confirmed. "Or worse, I could become a conduit for uncontrolled magical energy. The kind of conduit that burns out everything around it before finally destroying itself." They stood in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the weight of what she had described. Finally, Eldric spoke again. "Would it save the kingdom? If it worked, yes. If I could restore the energy flows, repair the damage that's been done, the crops would recover, the land would heal. But the risk is mine to take," Maera finished firmly. "Not yours to demand." Eldric nodded slowly. "I understand, but I had to ask." Maera looked at him with new eyes, seeing something in his expression that hadn't been there during their first confrontation. The desperate king was still present, but so was something else. A man who was beginning to understand the true cost of the choices he was asking her to make. "You're changing," she said suddenly. "Am I?" He seemed genuinely surprised by the observation. The man who threatened to force me into bearing his heir wouldn't have asked about the risks to my life. He would have demanded I attempt the working, regardless of the consequences. Eldric's jaw tightened. That man was a fool who thought he could command loyalty through fear. "I'm learning that some things, the things that matter most, can only be given freely." "Costly lesson," Maera observed. "The most important ones usually are." He turned to face her fully. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. For what I said when Elena died. For how I've treated you since your return. For thinking I could simply take what I needed from you without considering what it might cost you." Maera felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually become forgiveness. "Apologies are a start," she said carefully. "But words are easier than actions." "Then let me show you." Eldric's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both. "Let me prove that I can be better than I was, that I can earn your trust instead of demanding your submission." "How?" "Work with me to expose Magnus. Help me understand what he's done and why. And in return," he paused, seeming to gather his courage, "in return, I'll release you from any obligation to the prophecy. If you choose to leave once this is resolved, I won't stop you." Maera stared at him. "You would let the kingdom die rather than force me to save it." "I would rather rule over ruins as an honorable man than over a restored kingdom as a tyrant," he said simply. "Elena taught me that kingdoms are made of people, not just land and titles. A king who destroys people to save his realm isn't a king worth following." The sincerity in his voice made something inside Maera's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "And if I choose to stay? If I decide to help, not because I must, but because I want to, then it will be the greatest gift I've ever received," Eldric said quietly, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Maera looked down at the spring, watching the light dance across its surface like captured stars. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than it had been since her return. "I'll think about it," she said. "But for now, we have more immediate Concerns. If Magnus is behind this sabotage, we need proof. And if he's planning something more than simple destruction, we need to stop him before he can finish whatever he's started. Eldric agreed. As they walked back toward the castle together, neither spoke of the way their hands had briefly touched when Eldric helped her over a fallen log, or how natural it had felt to walk in step beside each other. Some changes happened too quietly to be acknowledged, even by those experiencing them. But in the grove behind them, the healing spring continued to flow, its light a little brighter than it had been in years. The truth came to Maera in the depths of the night, when she was rifling through Clara's recipe book by candlelight. She had been unable to sleep, her mind churning with thoughts of the spring and Magnus and the growing certainty that something vital was still hidden from them. The old cookbook, with its mixture of culinary advice and folk remedies, had seemed like a comforting distraction. Instead, it became the key that unlocked everything, tucked between a recipe for winter stew and instructions for preserving herbs. Maera found a pressed flower, a purple bloom she recognized immediately, nightshade. Not the deadly variety, but its cousin, a plant used in very specific types of magical working, particularly the kind used to suppress supernatural abilities. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the flower, her mind racing back through years of memory. Elena's final days, when the fever had raged despite every remedy Maera tried. The way her healing powers had seemed to falter at the crucial moment, leaving her helpless as the queen slipped away. She had blamed herself, assumed it was grief and exhaustion that had crippled her gift when she needed it most. But what if it hadn't been exhaustion at all? With trembling hands, she turned the pages of the cookbook, looking for more evidence of what she was beginning to suspect. There, another pressed flower, this one a variant of wolfsbane known for its ability to disrupt magical energy. And there, written in Clara's careful script, for calming difficult temperaments, 1 pinch in evening tea, no more than twice weekly. Maera's breath came in short gasps as the implications crashed over her. Someone had been drugging her. For years, someone had been systematically weakening her gift, ensuring that when the crucial moment came, she would fail to save Elena. The perfect crime. Murder disguised as natural death, with the kingdom's most skilled healer taking the blame for her own magically induced incompetence. She thought of all the evening teas Clara had brought her during Elena's illness, the kindly insistence that she needed to keep her strength up, the way her powers had flickered and failed at exactly the moments when they were most needed, the guilt and self-doubt that had followed, destroying her confidence so completely that she couldn't access her gift even when the drugs were no longer in her system. "My God," she whispered, the cookbook falling from nerveless fingers. "Oh my God!" But even as the horror of it sank in, another realization followed close behind. Clara was in her 70s, had been with the castle since before Eldric was born. She had neither the knowledge nor the magical ability to plan something this sophisticated, which meant she's working for someone else. Maera breathed, without stopping to consider the wisdom of her actions. Maera grabbed the cookbook and ran from her chamber. The castle corridors were dark and cold, lit only by the occasional torch that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. She made her way to Eldric's quarters by instinct, her bare feet silent on the flagstones. The guards at his door knew her by now, had grown accustomed to her late-night conversations with their king. They stepped aside without question, allowing her to enter the outer chamber where Eldric conducted his daily business. "Eldric," she called softly, not wanting to wake the entire wing but desperate to share what she had discovered. He emerged from his sleeping chamber within moments, still pulling on a robe over his nightclothes. His hair was tousled and his eyes heavy with sleep, but he took one look at her face and was instantly alert. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving toward her, with concern written in every line of his body. "Clara?" Maera said, holding up the cookbook with shaking hands. It's Clara. She poisoned me. For years, she's been putting herbs in my tea that suppress magical ability. That's why I couldn't save Eleanor. That's why my gift is gone. Eldric's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally a growing horror as he processed what she was telling him. "Show me," he said quietly. Maera opened the cookbook to the relevant pages, pointing out the pressed flowers and the careful notations that revealed their true purpose. As Eldric read Clara's handwriting, instructions for dosages, timing, methods of disguising the taste, his expression grew darker. "This can't be right," he said finally. "Clara raised me. She's been like a mother to this castle for decades. Why would she? She's working for someone," Maera interrupted. "Someone who wanted Elena dead and me blamed for it. Someone who needed my gift neutralized, so I couldn't interfere with their plans." "Magnus," Eldric breathed. "It has to be. Who else would have that kind of influence over her? Who else would know enough about magical theory to design this kind of systematic poisoning?" Maera began pacing the chamber, her mind working furiously. "Think about it. Elena dies. I'm blamed and exiled. The kingdom starts failing. Magnus becomes your sole advisor, the only one you trust. He's been positioning himself as indispensable while slowly destroying everything that might threaten his influence." Eldric sank into a chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a shroud. The construction work in the dungeons, the magical drainage, the failing crops, all of it designed to weaken the kingdom until you were desperate. "Enough to do anything to save it," Maera finished, "including forcing me to bear your heir. But an heir born of coercion would have no legitimacy in the eyes of the old magic. The kingdom would continue to fail, and eventually he would suggest himself as a replacement ruler," Eldric said grimly. "A regency, perhaps, until the heir came of age. Except the heir would never be strong enough to reclaim the throne." They stared at each other in the candlelight, the full scope of Magnus's plan becoming clear between them. It was brilliant in its way, a slow-motion coup that would leave him in control of a weakened but still viable kingdom, with all his enemies either dead, exiled, or discredited. "How long do you think we have?" Maera asked. "Not long," Eldric replied. "If he suspects we're getting close to the truth." He was interrupted by a soft knock at the chamber door. "Your Majesty." Clara's voice came through the heavy wood, sweet and concerned as always. "I heard voices. Is everything all right?" Eldric and Maera froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. How much had the older woman heard? How long had she been listening outside the door? "Fine, Clara," Eldric called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just couldn't sleep. You can return to your quarters." "Oh, but I brought warm milk," Clara said, and they could hear the door handle beginning to turn. "You know how it helps you rest." "Don't come in," Eldric said sharply, rising from his chair. But it was too late. The door swung open, revealing Clara standing in the corridor with a tray in her hands and an expression of motherly concern on her face. Her eyes immediately found the cookbook in Maera's hands, and her entire demeanor shifted. "Oh," she said softly, her voice suddenly cold. "I see you've been reading my recipes." The warm milk crashed to the floor as Clara's hand moved to something hidden in her apron. When it emerged, it held a small crystal vial filled with dark liquid, the same type of vial Maera had seen among Clara's cooking supplies for years. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Clara said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "I really did hope we could avoid unpleasantness." "How long?" Maera asked, her voice barely steady. "How long have you been working against us?" Clara's face softened with what might have been genuine regret. "Since before you were born, child. Since Magnus showed me what this kingdom could become under proper guidance." She stepped fully into the chamber, closing the door behind her with her free hand. "He's the only one who truly understands what needs to be done." "You killed Elena," Eldric said, his voice raw with betrayal and grief. "You killed my wife and unborn child. I weakened the healer so she couldn't interfere with fate," Clara corrected gently. "Elena's death was necessary, my lord. She was too strong, too influential. As long as she lived, you would never be desperate enough to make the difficult choices required for the kingdom's survival." "Survival?" Maera's voice cracked with disbelief. "You've been systematically destroying this place for years." "I've been preparing it for transformation," Clara said firmly. "The old ways were failing, hereditary rule based on bloodlines rather than merit, magical systems that favored birth over ability. Magnus has a vision for something better." "Magnus has a vision for himself on the throne," Eldric snarled, taking a step toward the woman who had raised him. Clara raised the vial, and they could see her thumb positioned over its corkstopper. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. The contents of this vial will ensure you both sleep peacefully while Magnus completes the transition of power. No pain, no suffering, just a gentle passage to whatever comes next." "Poison," Maera said flatly. "Mercy," Clara replied. "Magnus wanted to handle this differently, but your recent investigations have forced our hand. The kingdom needs strong leadership, not a broken king clinging to the ghosts of past glory." Eldric's hand moved slowly toward the dagger he kept on his desk, but Clara noticed the movement immediately. "I wouldn't," she said sadly. "You may be faster than an old woman, but this vial breaks very easily. The poison inside becomes airborne when exposed to air. Something I learned from Magnus's extensive research. We would all die together, and the kingdom would pass to his capable hands regardless." "Why?" Maera asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Why betray everything you've claimed to love for so many years?" Clara's expression grew distant, almost wistful. "Because I've seen what weak leadership costs a kingdom. I was young when the plague of shadows swept through the eastern provinces. Hundreds died, while the old king hesitated, unwilling to make the hard choices necessary to stop the spread. Magnus was just a young scholar then, but he understood what needed to be done. "So you've been planning this for decades," Eldric said. "We've been preparing," Clara confirmed. "Watching, learning, positioning ourselves to act when the time was right. Elena's death was simply the beginning, a way to isolate you, to make you dependent on Magnus's counsel while removing the one person who might have seen through our plans." Maera felt a surge of rage so pure it made her hands shake. "She trusted you. We all trusted you. You were like a mother to half the people in this castle. And I loved you all," Clara said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "But love without strength is useless. Magnus will be the strong ruler this kingdom needs, even if it means I have to betray the people I've cared for." The old woman's thumb moved toward the vial's cork, and Maera knew they were out of time. But as she watched Clara's face, something Eleanor had once told her came flooding back, advice about healing that could just as easily apply to harm. "Clara, wait," she said urgently. "Before you do this, tell me one thing. The nightshade you used to suppress my powers. How did you prepare it?" Clara paused, obviously confused by the question. "Dried and powdered, mixed with wolfsbane extract to amplify the effect." "Why?" "Because," Maera said, her voice gaining strength, "you just told me exactly how to reverse what you did to me." Before Clara could react, Maera pressed her hands to her temples and reached deep inside herself, searching for the spark of power she had thought was gone forever. But now she knew it wasn't gone, just buried under years of magical suppression and self-doubt. The knowledge of what had been done to her, the understanding of how the poison had worked, became the key to unlocking what she had lost. Light blazed between her fingers, not the gentle glow of healing magic, but something fiercer, more desperate. Raw power that had been compressed and contained for years, finally breaking free with the force of a dam bursting. Clara stumbled backward, the vial falling from her suddenly nerveless fingers. But instead of shattering on the stone floor, it froze in mid-air, caught in a web of golden energy that pulsed with Maera's heartbeat. "Impossible," Clara whispered. "Nothing's impossible," Maera said, power crackling in her voice. "You just have to understand what you're working with." The vial drifted gently to Eldric's desk, settling there as safely as if it had been placed by careful hands. Around them, the air shimmered with released magic. Years of suppressed power, finally finding expression. But even as relief flooded through her at the return of her gift, Maera realized their problems were far from over. Clara might be neutralized, but Magnus was still free, still dangerous, and now he would know that his carefully laid plans had been discovered. "How long before Magnus realizes something's wrong?" Eldric asked, as if reading her thoughts. Clara slumped against the door with defeat written across her weathered features, looked up at them with something that might have been pride. "He already knows," she said softly. "Did you really think he would trust something this important to an old woman acting alone?" The implications of her words hit them like a physical blow. If Magnus knew they had discovered the truth, if he was already moving to implement whatever final phase of his plan remained. "The spring," Maera breathed. "He's going to try to drain the healing spring." Eldric was already moving toward his weapons, understanding immediately. If Magnus could corrupt or destroy the last untainted source of magical energy in the kingdom, any hope of restoration would die with it. And if they didn't stop him, Clara's prediction about the kingdom needing new leadership would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Outside the chamber windows, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the sky. Soon the final confrontation would begin. But for the first time since her return, Maera felt ready to face whatever was coming. Her gift had returned, burned clean by the truth of what had been done to her. Now it was time to use it, not just to heal, but to fight for the kingdom she was finally ready to call home. Dawn broke grey and cold over the castle as Eldric strapped on armor he hadn't worn since the last war. The mail and plate felt heavier than he remembered, but also familiar, a second skin he had shed in peacetime, but never truly forgotten. Beside him, Maera worked with swift, sure movements to gather what she would need for the confrontation ahead. Her healing satchel, the same worn leather bag she had carried during the war years, now bulged with supplies both medicinal and magical. Vials of restorative draughts clinked softly against containers of more volatile substances, things that could heal or harm depending on the intent behind their use. The return of her gift had brought with it a clarity of purpose that sharpened every movement, every decision. "The guards loyal to Magnus?" Eldric asked, testing the edge of his sword. "Fewer than you might think," replied Captain Torres, the grizzled veteran who commanded what remained of the castle's military force. He had arrived at first light, summoned by Eldric's urgent message, and quick to grasp the situation once apprised of Magnus's treachery. Most of the men remember who they swore their oaths to. It's the newer recruits we'll need to watch. Magnus has been cultivating them for years. Clara sat bound but unguarded in the corner of the room, her presence a reminder of how deeply the corruption had spread. She had said nothing since revealing Magnus's awareness of their discovery, but her eyes tracked every preparation with the attention of someone calculating odds. "He'll be at the spring," Maera said with certainty. "It's the only source of untainted power left in the kingdom. If he can corrupt it, twist it to his purposes, the land dies completely," Eldric finished, "and with it any hope of magical restoration." "More than that," Maera corrected grimly. "If he drains the spring entirely, channels all that power into himself, he won't need the throne. He'll have enough magical energy to simply take whatever he wants." The thought sent a chill through the assembled group. They had been thinking in terms of political coup, of careful maneuvering for position and influence. But if Magnus truly meant to absorb the spring's power directly, they were facing something far more dangerous, a man who would emerge from the confrontation either dead or effectively unstoppable. "How long does such a working take?" Torres asked. "Hours," Maera replied. The kind of power stored in that spring can't be channeled quickly, without destroying the conduit. He'll need time to prepare, time to execute, time to safely integrate what he takes. She looked out the window toward the eastern wall. But once he begins, stopping him becomes exponentially more difficult. Eldric moved to stand beside her, following her gaze toward the grove where the spring lay hidden. "What do you need from us?" "Time," she said immediately, "and space to work. If I'm going to counter whatever working he's attempting, I'll need to reach the spring itself, but more than that." She turned to face him fully. "I'll need you to trust me. What I'm planning, the magic I'll have to use, it's going to look dangerous, because it will be dangerous." "How dangerous?" Maera's smile held no humor. "The kind where we either save the kingdom or I burn out every magical conduit within a mile radius, including myself." "There has to be another way," Eldric said urgently. "There is," she replied. "We could let Magnus succeed, then spend the rest of our short lives as subjects of a magical tyrant. But I don't think that's what Elena would have wanted for her kingdom." The mention of his dead wife hit Eldric like a physical blow, but it also straightened his spine and set his jaw. Maera was right. Elena had believed in the kingdom's people, in their right to determine their own fate. She would never have accepted subjugation, no matter how painful the alternative. "What do you need us to do?" he asked. "Get me to the spring," Maera said simply. "Everything else I can handle." Torres cleared his throat diplomatically. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but Magnus won't be undefended. He's too smart for that. And if he's already begun his working, he'll have guards, magical defenses, probably traps designed specifically to stop someone like me." Maera nodded. "Which is why I won't be going alone." She turned to Eldric, and he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not just determination, but something deeper, a trust that had been slowly rebuilding over the weeks of their cautious reconciliation. "The prophecy speaks of willing union," she said quietly. "Royal blood and healer blood joined in common purpose. I've been thinking about what that really means. Maera, not marriage," she said quickly. "Not yet anyway, but partnership. True partnership, where we stand together against the threats to our people." She held out her hand to him. "If you're willing to trust me with your life, I'm willing to trust you with mine." Eldric stared at her outstretched hand, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. Not just cooperation, but true alliance, the kind that could only exist between equals who chose to stand together. "The magical bonding," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "If we do this, then we do it knowing that we're choosing each other freely," Maera finished. "Not because of threats or prophecies, or desperate circumstances, but because we believe in the same things. Because we're stronger together than apart." Around them, the room had gone quiet. Torres, the guards, even bound, Clara watched as Eldric slowly reached out to take Maera's hand. The moment their skin touched, power flared between them. Not painful, but startling in its intensity. Maera's returned gift resonated with something in Eldric's bloodline, creating harmonics that neither had expected. "Well," Maera said breathlessly, "that's new. Is it supposed to feel like that?" Eldric asked, marveling at the way their joined hands seemed to pulse with shared energy. "I have no idea," Maera admitted, "but it feels right." The magical resonance between them settled into something sustainable, a constant low-level awareness of each other's presence and emotional state. It was intimate in a way that went beyond physical touch, and for a moment both of them were overwhelmed by the implications. Then Torres coughed politely, reminding them that they had an audience and a mission to complete. "How does this change our approach?" the captain asked pragmatically. "It doesn't," Eldric said, though his voice carried new confidence. "We still need to reach the spring, still need to stop Magnus. But now we do it as partners," Maera finished. "Equal partners, with equal stakes in the outcome." She looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who would be risking their lives in the next few hours. "I won't lie to you," she said formally. What we're attempting is dangerous. Magnus has had years to prepare, and he's not the kind of man who leaves things to chance. Some of us may not survive this, but if we don't try, Eldric added, the kingdom dies slowly, while we watch, and that's not survival, that's just a longer death. Torres nodded grimly. The men know what's at stake, Your Majesty. They'll follow you into whatever's waiting. Then let's not keep Magnus waiting any longer, Maera said, shouldering her satchel and checking the security of the various containers and implements she would need. The longer we delay, the stronger his position becomes. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Clara spoke for the first time in hours. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. Magnus has planned for every contingency, considered every possible threat. You're walking into a trap that's been years in the making. Maybe, Eldric replied, pausing at the door. But we're walking in together as equals, and that's something he never planned for. Hope, Clara said with something that might have been sadness, is a poor substitute for power. We'll find out, Maera said gently, but I'd rather die hoping than live in despair. With that, they left Clara to her regrets and made their way through corridors that suddenly felt like the arteries of a living thing preparing for battle. Behind them, the sun climbed higher into a sky that promised either salvation or catastrophe before it set again. The final confrontation was about to begin, and for the first time since this all started, both Eldric and Maera felt truly ready to face whatever was waiting for them in the grove where ancient magic still flowed. The truth serum bubbled softly in its crystal vial as Maera added the final ingredient, 3 drops of water from the healing spring taken during their reconnaissance. Of the grove, the potion glowed with faint silver light, its surface reflecting not the room around them, but something deeper, more fundamental. Truth, when properly distilled, had a luminescence all its own. This will compel honest answers, she explained, to Eldric, as they huddled behind the fallen oak that provided their only cover. But it has to be administered carefully. Too much, and the subject's mind simply shuts down, rather than reveal difficult truths. Magnus stood at the center of the grove, his arms raised toward the healing spring as power flowed upward in visible streams of golden light. The working was more advanced than they had hoped. Already, the advisor's form was beginning to blur at the edges, becoming translucent as magical energy saturated his body. Around him, a circle of guards stood at precise intervals, their eyes glowing with the same golden light that marked them as magically bound to his will. How many? Eldric whispered. 6 guards, plus Magnus himself, Torres reported from his position on their left flank. But the guards aren't really there anymore. They're just extensions of his consciousness now. Kill the puppet master, and the puppets fall. Or, Maera said grimly, fail to kill him quickly enough, and he uses their life force to complete the absorption. Either way, this ends with Magnus. The plan they had developed was simple in concept, but perilous in execution. Maera would use her restored gift to disrupt Magnus's working, creating a window of vulnerability during which Eldric could close the distance for a killing strike. The truth serum would ensure that any revelations Magnus made during the confrontation would be genuine, important for understanding the full scope of his conspiracy, but timing would be everything. Too early, and Magnus would simply redirect the disruption into his working, making himself stronger. Too late, and he would have absorbed too much power to be stopped by conventional means. He's accelerating the process, Maera observed, watching. The streams of energy flowing from the spring. This should take hours, but he's compressing it into minutes. Because he knows we're here, Eldric said. More than that, Torres added. Look at his hands. They were right. Magnus's hands, raised toward the spring, were beginning to smoke, not from fire, but from the sheer amount of magical energy he was forcing through his mortal form. He was sacrificing his body's long-term integrity for immediate power, burning himself out in exchange for the certainty of success. He's not planning to survive this in his current form, Maera realized with growing horror. He's going to abandon his physical body entirely, become something else. Something made of pure, magical energy. The implications were staggering. If Magnus succeeded, he wouldn't just be a powerful sorcerer, he would be effectively immortal, a being of living magic that could reshape reality according to his will. The kingdom wouldn't just fall to a tyrant. It would be remade in the image of one man's twisted vision. Change of plans, Eldric said grimly, drawing his sword. We can't wait for the perfect moment. We go now. But even as he prepared to charge, Maera caught his arm. Wait, she said, urgently. Something's wrong. She was right. Magnus had stopped chanting, his attention turning away from the spring towards something beyond their sight. In the sudden silence, they could hear what had distracted him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast. Reinforcements? Torres suggested hopefully. Wrong direction, Eldric said, his expression darkening. Those riders are coming from the east, from the neighboring kingdoms. Through the trees they caught glimpses of mounted figures in unfamiliar colors, their movements coordinated and purposeful. As the riders drew closer, banners became visible. The Black Wolf of Valderon, the Silver Eagle of Northmarch, the Red Rose of the Southern Reach. My God, Eldric breathed. It's an invasion force. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. Magnus hadn't just been planning a coup within the kingdom. He had been coordinating with external enemies, promising them easy conquest of a magically weakened realm. The timing was perfect. Drain the kingdom's defenses, eliminate or corrupt its leaders, then step aside while foreign armies carved up the territory. He never intended to rule alone, Maera said, understanding flooding through her. He planned to be the puppet king of a conquered territory, governing at the pleasure of whoever offered him the best terms. Magnus's laughter echoed across the grove as he turned to face their hiding place. Did you really think I hadn't planned for every contingency? He called out, his voice carrying easily despite the magical energy crackling around him. Including the possibility that you might discover my activities prematurely? He gestured, and the golden light surrounding him pulsed outward in a wave that stripped away their concealment. The fallen oak that had hidden them crumbled to dust, leaving them exposed in the winter morning light. Your Majesty, Magnus said, with a mocking bow. And the lovely Lady Maera returned from her well-deserved exile. How convenient that you've both come to witness the dawn of a new age. The only thing dawning here is your death, Eldric snarled, starting forward with his sword raised. I think not, Magnus replied calmly. He raised one hand, and Eldric found himself frozen in place, held by bonds of pure, magical force. You see, I've had years to prepare for this moment, years to study the old magics, to understand how power truly works in this world. The advisor began walking toward them, his form flickering between solid flesh and translucent energy. Did you know that the healing spring isn't just a source of power? It's a conduit, a direct connection to the magical foundations of reality itself. Absorb enough of its energy, and one can rewrite the very laws that govern this realm, which is why, Maera said, stepping forward with the truth serum vial in her hands, you're going to tell us exactly what you've done and how we can undo it. Magnus's eyes fixed on the glowing vial, and for the first time his confidence seemed to waver. Interesting. Where did you find the components for such a working? I have my sources, Maera replied, moving closer despite the magical energy that made the air itself feel thick and dangerous. The question is, are you brave enough to take it willingly, or do I need to find a more creative method of administration? The sound of hoofbeats was growing louder, and through the trees they could see the first of the foreign riders entering the grove. Magnus smiled at the sound. It seems we're about to have company, he said pleasantly. Perhaps this would be an excellent time for you to surrender and accept the inevitable. Instead, Maera uncorked the vial and threw its contents directly at Magnus's face. The truth serum struck Magnus squarely in the face, its silver luminescence spreading across his features like liquid starlight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the advisor's carefully constructed magical defenses began to unravel, not through force, but through honesty. The energy he had been absorbing from the spring stuttered and faltered as the compulsion to speak truth disrupted his concentration. Clever. He gasped, his form solidifying as the magical absorption stopped, but ultimately futile. You want truth? Here's truth. I've been planning this for 30 years, since your father's weakness during the Plague of Shadows showed me what incompetent leadership costs a kingdom. The words came out in a rush, propelled by the serum's inexorable power. Around them, the foreign riders had formed a loose circle, their weapons drawn, but their attention focused on the magical confrontation at the grove's center. They had come expecting conquest, not whatever this was turning into. Elena discovered your plans, Maera said, pressing her advantage. That's why you had her killed. She was asking too many questions about the failing crops, about patterns. In the magical disruptions, Magnus admitted, his voice tight with the effort of trying to resist the serum's effects. She was too intelligent, too observant, and her influence over Eldric made her dangerous. So you had Clara poison me to ensure I couldn't save her, Maera continued relentlessly. Clara is, a true believer in the necessity of strong leadership. When I explained what needed to be done, she understood that some sacrifices were required for the greater good. Magnus's eyes blazed with fanatic certainty, even as the serum forced him to reveal his crimes. The kingdom was dying under Eldric's peaceful rule. Only radical action could save it. By destroying it first, Eldric snarled, the magical bonds holding him beginning to weaken as Magnus's concentration continued to falter. By preparing it for transformation, Magnus corrected. These riders, he gestured toward the foreign soldiers, they're not conquerors, they're liberators. Each one represents a kingdom that has prospered under enlightened autocracy rather than hereditary incompetence. The restored scepter in Maera's other hand began to glow with soft white light, responding to the magical energies swirling through the grove. As Magnus spoke, she could feel the truth of his words resonating through the ancient artifact, but also something else. The scepter was reacting to deception within the truth, lies wrapped in honest admissions. You're not telling us everything, she said, raising the scepter higher. What else? What's the real endgame here? Magnus tried to resist, his face contorting with effort, but the truth serum's power was absolute. The neighboring kingdoms don't want to rule this territory directly, he gasped. Too much trouble, too much resistance. They want a puppet, someone who appears to be local royalty but answers to their interests. You, Eldric said with dawning horror. Me, Magnus confirmed, a regency council, supposedly temporary, while the realm recovers from its current crisis. But crises have a way of perpetuating themselves when it serves the regent's interests. The scepter's light intensified, and Maera felt power flowing through it. Not just her own restored gift, but something older and more fundamental. The magical bonds holding Eldric snapped as Magnus's control finally broke completely. And if the true king objects? Eldric asked, advancing with his sword raised. Then tragic accidents happen, Magnus replied, still unable to stop the words from pouring out. Hunting mishaps, unexpected illnesses, falls from great heights. Clara has quite an extensive knowledge of such possibilities. Around them, the foreign riders were beginning to look uncertain. This wasn't the quick, clean conquest they had been promised. Their puppet ruler was confessing to decades of treason. Their supposed local ally was clearly unhinged, and whatever magical working they had interrupted was filling the air with dangerous, unpredictable energy. Captain Valdris, one of the riders, called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. Perhaps we should reconsider our position here. But Magnus heard them, and the truth serum forced him to respond to their implied threat. You can't leave, he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "We have an agreement. Your kings promised me." "Our kings promised to support a viable puppet," the captain replied coldly. "Not a raving madman who confesses his crimes to his enemies. The bargain is void." In the moment of distraction that followed, Maera acted. The restored scepter pulsed with power as she drove it into the ground at the edge of the healing spring, its ancient magic connecting with the damaged energy lines that fed the grove. Light exploded outward from the point of contact, not the golden light of raw power that Magnus had been channeling, but the pure white radiance of healing and restoration. "What are you doing?" Magnus screamed, lunging toward her. Eldric intercepted him with a move that spoke of decades of battlefield experience, his sword slicing across the advisor's path in an arc that would have been lethal if Magnus had maintained his charge. Instead, the older man twisted away, his movements unnaturally quick, as residual magical energy enhanced his reflexes. "Restoring what you broke," Maera replied, her hands glowing as power flowed through her into the scepter and from there into the kingdom's magical infrastructure, healing what you poisoned. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Throughout the grove, plants that had been withered and dying began to straighten and bloom. The spring's flow increased, its water running clearer and brighter than it had in years. Most importantly, the energy lines that had been severed or corrupted began to reconnect, sending healing power racing out toward the castle and the surrounding countryside. "No!" Magnus shrieked, making another desperate lunge toward the scepter. "You don't understand. The kingdom needs strong leadership. Democracy is a luxury we can't afford." This time, Eldric didn't intercept him. Instead, he stepped aside and let Magnus's momentum carry him directly into the path of Maera's working. The advisor's scream cut off abruptly as the pure, magical energy struck him, not to heal because he was not wounded, but to cleanse, to burn away the accumulated corruption of decades spent twisting magic to serve his ambitions. Magnus stood frozen for a moment, his body outlined in brilliant white light. When it faded, he collapsed to the ground, alive but changed. The fanatic certainty was gone from his eyes, replaced by confusion and something that might have been remorse. "What have I done?" he whispered, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "Exactly what you intended," Maera replied sadly. "The serum didn't create your beliefs, Magnus. It only forced you to speak them honestly." Around them, the foreign riders were already withdrawing, their captains issuing quick orders for a tactical retreat. Without Magnus's promised cooperation and local knowledge, conquest had become a much less attractive proposition. But even as the immediate threats faded, Maera could feel the tremendous strain of channeling so much power through her mortal form. The scepter was helping, serving as a focus and conduit, but the working she had undertaken was at the very limits of what any human healer could sustain. "Enough," Eldric said urgently, seeing the toll it was taking on her. "You've done enough. Let the rest heal naturally." "Not yet," Maera gasped, sweat beading on her forehead as she fought to maintain control of the massive energies flowing through her. "The corruption goes deeper than just the energy lines. There are poison nodes throughout the system, places where Magnus concentrated his sabotage. If I don't cleanse them now—" Her words were cut off as another wave of power surged through. The scepter, this one so intense that the air around her began to shimmer with heat. But she held on, guided by instincts honed during years of healing work, pushing herself beyond all safe limits to ensure that the kingdom's magical foundation was truly restored. The moment stretched endlessly, balanced on the knife's edge between salvation and catastrophe. Then finally, the last of the corrupted energy was purged, and Maera collapsed beside the spring, her task complete. 6 months later, Maera stood in Eleanor's garden, her hands deep in rich dark soil that bloomed with life at her touch. The roses had returned, more vibrant than they had ever been, their roots drawing sustenance from energy lines that pulsed with renewed strength. But these weren't Elena's roses exactly. They were something new, a hybrid of the old varieties and wild blooms that had seeded themselves during the garden's years of darkness. Like the kingdom itself, the garden had emerged from its trial, changed but stronger. "The unity crown suits you," Clara said from the stone bench where she sat shelling peas for the evening meal. Her words carried none of their old warmth, but neither did they hold malice. The truth serum's revelation of her crimes had earned her a life sentence of service rather than execution, a mercy that surprised no one who knew Maera's nature. The crown in question rested on the garden's central table, its metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. Forged from the melted-down remains of Eldric's old crown and the silver implements from Maera's healing kit, it was both more modest and more meaningful than the ancient artifact it had replaced. Two bands intertwined into one, symbolizing partnership rather than dominance. "It feels strange," Maera admitted, pausing in her work to study the crown. "6 months ago, I was an exile with no home and no future. Now you're queen of a realm that exists because you chose to save it rather than abandon it to its fate," Eldric said, emerging from the castle with their young son cradled in his arms. At 3 months old, Prince Darian already showed signs of inheriting both his parents' gifts. His touch could soothe pain, and plants seemed to grow more vibrantly in his presence. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not at all in the way any of them had expected. The willing union it demanded had come not from coercion or political necessity, but from genuine partnership forged in crisis and tempered by mutual respect. Their marriage, celebrated on the spring equinox with representatives from all corners of the now prosperous kingdom, had been a joyous affair that felt more like a confirmation of something that already existed than the creation of something new. "He's growing so fast," Maera said, accepting their son and marveling at how perfectly he fit in her arms. "Soon he'll be walking, then talking, then probably lecturing us about proper magical theory." "Like his mother," Eldric said with a smile that transformed his weathered features. The lines of worry and desperation that had marked his face during the dark months were gone, replaced by something softer but no less strong. "Like both his parents," Maera corrected. "You forget. You're the one who insisted on reading him military strategy texts as bedtime stories." "Sun Tzu is very soothing when properly presented," Eldric defended himself. "Besides, a future king should understand both healing and warfare, even if we hope he'll need the former more than the latter." They settled onto the garden bench together, a family in the truest sense, despite the unconventional path that had brought them here. Around them, the kingdom flourished in ways both visible and subtle. The crops had recovered from their years of magical drought, the people had returned to lands they had thought permanently blighted, and trade routes that had withered during the dark years were reopening as word spread of the realm's restoration. But, perhaps more importantly, the kingdom had learned something about the relationship between ruler and ruled. The crisis had forced difficult conversations about accountability, about the balance between authority and service, about what it truly meant to govern with the consent of the governed. "Magnus seems better," Maera observed, watching the former. Advisor tend to the herb garden with careful, precise movements. The magical cleansing he had undergone had burned away his fanatic certainty, leaving behind a man who was slowly learning to live with the full knowledge of what his ambitions had cost. "He's finding purpose in simple work," Eldric replied. "Yesterday he asked if he could help design better irrigation systems for the outer villages. Small projects, practical solutions, nothing that requires the kind of grand vision that led him astray before." "Redemption is possible for anyone," Maera said softly, "even those who've fallen the farthest. But it has to be chosen, just like everything else that matters." Prince Darian made a soft sound in his sleep, his tiny hand closing around one of Maera's fingers with the instinctive trust of the very young. Looking down at him, she felt a surge of fierce protectiveness mixed with hope for the future he would inherit. What kind of world are we leaving him? She wondered aloud. A better one than we inherited, Eldric said with conviction. Not perfect. Probably. Never perfect, but one where power serves people rather than the other way around, where strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you choose to protect. As if summoned by their conversation about the future, a young page appeared at the garden's entrance, bowing respectfully before approaching. "Your Majesties," he said formally, "the delegation from the Northern Territories has arrived for the Harvest Festival. They bring gifts and proposals for expanded trade agreements." "Tell them we'll receive them in the Great Hall within the hour," Eldric replied, "and ensure they're offered refreshment and comfortable quarters." As the page hurried away, Maera looked at her husband with amusement. "Your Majesty, I thought we agreed on a more informal court protocol." "Old habits," Eldric admitted, "but you're right. We should set the example we want to see." He stood and offered her his hand. "Shall we go meet our guests, my queen? Our kingdom awaits." Maera took his hand and allowed him to help her rise, their son still sleeping peacefully in her arms. As they walked toward the castle together, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here, from exile and desperation to partnership and hope, from broken dreams to new possibilities.